It's now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Panu Luukkonen. He's going to talk about NAFLD and the mitochondrial redox state.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, so I will talk about NAFLD and mitochondrial redox state. NAFLD is strongly associated with central obesity and insulin resistance, and can produce progress in the liver from steatosis to steatohepatitis and liver cirrhosis. And this insulin-resistant NAFLD also predisposes to cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. However, recent studies have shown that NAFLD is heterogeneous. There are 5 common genetic variants which modulate the risk of NAFLD, as well as the severity of NAFLD within the liver. And these genetic variants include PNPLA3, TM6SF2, and MBOT7, which increase the risk of NAFLD. And recently, 2 genes, one in HSD17B13 and one in MARC1, have been implicated in protection against NAFLD. However, and interestingly, these genetic modulators of NAFLD do not predispose to type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease. And NAFLD is associated with or characterized by increased intrahepatic triglycerides, which may arise from adipose tissue lipolysis, where triglycerides in adipose tissue get hydrolyzed into fatty acids and are taken up by the liver and re-esterified into triglycerides. And liver is a unique organ in a way that it can convert non-fat substrates such as glucose and amino acids into triglycerides via de novo lipogenesis pathway, which is dependent on tricarboxylic acid cycle activity in hepatic mitochondria. And whether changes in these metabolic pathways may explain the heterogeneity of NAFLD is unclear. And hepatic tricarboxylic acid oxidation has been shown in many human studies to be decreased in NASH, but the underlying mechanism has remained unclear. And very recently, we showed in humans that the ketogenic diet increases hepatic availability of non-esterified fatty acids, which are then taken up by hepatic mitochondria and undergo beta oxidation into acetyl-CoA molecules. And simultaneously, beta oxidation increases mitochondrial redox state, or the ratio of reduced and oxidized form of NAD molecules, which are important cofactors in hundreds of molecular reactions. And this excess of reduced form of NAD inhibits mitochondrial TCA oxidation and leaves only one fate for the excess acetyl-CoA molecules in the hepatic mitochondria, which is ketogenic pathway to be converted to acetoacetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate. And importantly, the conversion of acetoacetate, which is a ketone body, into another ketone body, beta-hydroxybutyrate, is dependent on NADH. And in a state where there's an excess of NADH, as in increased hepatic mitochondrial redox state, it favors the conversion of acetoacetate into beta-hydroxybutyrate. And these ketone bodies are then secreted into circulation and can be measured. And increased NADH to NAD plus or mitochondrial redox state is reflected in the circulation as increased beta-hydroxybutyrate to acetoacetate ratio. And this leads us to a hypothesis that increased liver fat in NAFLD and particularly in NASH could lead to increased concentrations of liver fatty acids, which are available for beta oxidation, and that would increase hepatic mitochondrial redox state and inhibit mitochondrial TCA oxidation and ultimately lead to mitochondrial dysfunction. And in the present study, we asked the following question: how insulin resistance on one hand and genetic variants on the other confer susceptibility to NAFLD? And to this end, we recruited 284 patients undergoing bariatric surgery. Mean age was 49 years, 72% were women, and the mean BMI was high, 43, because of the bariatric surgery patients. And liver histology was assessed using the SAF score. Hepatic insulin resistance was assessed by the HOMA-IR insulin resistance index. Genetic risk score was defined as the number of risk increasing alleles in the 5 genes: PNPLA3, TM6SF2, MBOT7, HSD17B13, and MARC1. And we also took serum samples of these patients and performed NMR metabolomics assessment. And we divided these 284 individuals to 6 groups with even sizes based on sex-specific HOMA-IR. And by definition, the groups with higher number had higher hepatic insulin resistance. Hepatic insulin resistance was associated with increased fasting serum insulin concentrations, but strikingly, there was no association between insulin resistance and the genetic risk score at all. And these panels show the association between hepatic insulin resistance and histological features of NAFLD. And hepatic insulin resistance was associated with severity of steatosis, ballooning, inflammation, fibrosis, and the total SAF score. And then we performed the NMR metabolomics analysis shown here, and we found that multiple fatty acids, such as monounsaturated fatty acids, saturated and polyunsaturated fatty acids, as well as glucose metabolites such as pyruvate, lactate, as well as amino acids, leucine, valine, phenylalanine, and isoleucine, were highly correlated with hepatic insulin resistance. However, there were no changes in hepatic mitochondrial redox state as determined by the beta-hydroxybutyrate to acetoacetate ratio. Next, we asked whether or does insulin resistance predispose to NAFLD by stimulating hepatic de novo lipogenesis from the excess substrates that we saw on the NMR metabolomics analysis, such as glucose and amino acids. And to this end, we studied 61 individuals who were not morbidly obese. The mean BMI was 31, and mean age was 50, and 66% were women. Liver fat content was assessed non-invasively using magnetic resonance spectroscopy, and hepatic de novo lipogenesis was assessed using the heavy water method. And like before, hepatic insulin resistance was determined using the HOMA-IR index and the genetic risk score as the number of risk increasing alleles in the 5 genes. And we divided the 61 individuals into high HOMA-IR and low HOMA-IR groups based on the sex-specific HOMA-IR median. And by definition, the high HOMA-IR group had higher HOMA-IR as compared to low HOMA-IR group. There were no association between the HOMA-IR and genetic risk score, similarly to the previous cohort. However, the more insulin-resistant group had higher intrahepatic triglyceride content. And this panel shows the hepatic de novo lipogenesis in the groups, and high HOMA-IR group had twofold higher rate of de novo lipogenesis in the liver as compared to low HOMA-IR group. So taken together, these data are consistent with increased availability of gluconeogenic substrate in insulin-resistant individuals, which then increases de novo lipogenesis in their livers and predisposes them to NAFLD. Next, we asked whether and does insulin resistance predispose to NAFLD because of excessive white adipose tissue lipolysis. And to this end, we recruited 41 individuals with mean age of 49 years, and 63% were women, and mean BMI was 30. Liver fat content was assessed using MRS as before, and the rate of white adipose tissue lipolysis was assessed using deuterated glycerol infusion during fasting state and during hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp. And insulin resistance in the liver was assessed using the HOMA-IR index as before, and the genetic risk score was defined as the number of risk increasing alleles in the 5 genes. We did similar grouping in these individuals based on sex-specific HOMA-IR into high and low HOMA-IR groups. There were no associations between the HOMA-IR and genetic risk score, but the insulin-resistant individuals had higher intrahepatic triglyceride content than the low HOMA-IR group. And this slide, this panel shows the suppression of glycerol turnover during hyperinsulinemia, which is a marker of insulin sensitivity in white adipose tissue lipolysis. And these data suggest that white adipose tissue lipolysis was stimulated in the insulin-resistant individuals. And so far, these data that I've shown have been known before, but now we get to the more interesting part, which is the genetic risk and how does cumulative genetic risk confer the susceptibility to NAFLD. And we took the same 284 individuals who underwent bariatric surgery for liver biopsies, and we divided them into six groups based on the number of risk alleles in the 5 NAFLD predisposing genes, G1 to G6. And by definition, the genetic risk score increased as a number of as the function of genetic risk score. Again, we saw dissociation between HOMA-IR and genetic risk score because the genetic risk score groups were not associated with HOMA-IR or fasting serum insulin concentrations. And similarly to the associations between insulin resistance, we observed associations between the genetic risk score and all features of NAFLD in liver biopsies, including steatosis, ballooning, inflammation, fibrosis, and total SAF score. And next, we performed the NMR metabolomics analysis and found strikingly that only a single metabolite was associated with the genetic risk score, and that was the beta-hydroxybutyrate to acetoacetate ratio, which reflects the hepatic mitochondrial redox state. And it was dose-dependently associated with the genetic risk score. However, there were no changes in circulating concentrations of substrates such as glucose, fatty acids, or amino acids. So the profile in the insulin resistant and the genetic component of NAFLD were strikingly different. So next we asked that does cumulative genetic risk predispose to NAFLD by stimulating hepatic de novo lipogenesis, like we asked before for insulin resistance. And to this end, we divided the 61 individuals who were studied for de novo lipogenesis based on genetic risk score into high and low groups. And there were no association between the genetic risk score and insulin resistance, but the high genetic risk score group had twofold higher intrahepatic triglycerides as compared to the low group. And strikingly and surprisingly, the rates of hepatic de novo lipogenesis in the high genetic risk score group were almost 50% lower than the low genetic risk score, even though there was increased intrahepatic triglyceride content in that group. So in these high genetic risk score individuals, we observed no changes in glucose or amino acid concentrations in the circulation or circulating insulin concentrations, but we were able to see a decrease in the rates of de novo lipogenesis. And what regulates de novo lipogenesis independent of substrates or insulin, and that is the hepatic mitochondrial redox state, which was significantly higher in the high genetic risk score group as compared to the low group. And these data are consistent with the increased hepatic mitochondrial redox state inhibiting TCA cycle activity and thereby leading to decreased citrate availability for de novo lipogenesis in the liver. And next, we asked, does cumulative genetic risk predispose to NAFLD because of excessive white adipose tissue lipolysis? And again, we divided the same individuals who were assessed for lipolysis based on the genetic risk score into high and low groups. And we found no association between the genetic risk score and insulin resistance, but the high genetic risk score group had higher intrahepatic triglycerides. But there were no changes in insulin sensitivity of the white adipose tissue lipolysis, suggesting that white adipose tissue lipolysis does not contribute to NAFLD in the genetic component of NAFLD. So this is the summary and working model. Let's go through first the metabolic component of NAFLD, where we saw increases in intrahepatic triglycerides. We saw increases in white adipose tissue lipolysis, which contributes to intrahepatic triglycerides by re-esterification of fatty acids. And we also saw increased availability of glucose and amino acids, which are the de novo lipogenic substrates, as well as increased rate of de novo lipogenesis, suggesting that also de novo lipogenesis contributed to the metabolic component of NAFLD. Insulin concentrations in serum were also increased in insulin-resistant individuals, which may also contribute to de novo lipogenesis and re-esterification of pre-existing fatty acids in the liver. However, there were no changes in intrahepatic mitochondrial redox state with respect to insulin resistance in our patients. But the genetic component of NAFLD was strikingly different. We observed no differences in white adipose tissue lipolysis, no changes in availability of different substrates in circulation or concentrations of serum insulin. Instead, we saw a marked increase in mitochondrial redox state, which in turn could contribute to mitochondrial dysfunction, which could then explain the decreased rates of de novo lipogenesis in the face of unchanged substrate concentrations and unchanged insulin concentrations. And because TCA cycle is also the place where hepatic fatty acids get terminally oxidized into carbon dioxide, this potential decrease in TCA cycle activity could have contributed to increased intrahepatic triglycerides because of the genetic component of NAFLD. So taken together, the contribution of these two different components in the pathogenesis of NAFLD, insulin resistance and cumulative genetic risk, confer strikingly different metabolic profile within the liver, and this may have implications for treatment of these patients. And finally, I want to acknowledge the working group as well as the funders. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Panu. So I will start because I don't see any question in the Q&R. I want to go back to the, thank you for your nice talk. I want to go back to the data, the genetic component that you showed, and the fact that, in fact, in the high genetic background patient, you see a decrease in de novo lipogenesis, right? Yes. And yet you see increased hepatic steatosis there, intrahepatic triglycerides. So first, were you surprised of this data? And yes. I didn't quite understand the explanation for the fact that DNL was decreased there. Sorry, maybe I missed the...
Yes, I completely understand this.
Sorry.
This is a complex topic, and I think this is not perfectly understood, and more experiments are needed to confirm these findings. But this indeed was surprising that despite we saw increases in liver fat content in these individuals, one of the main pathways contributing fat to the liver, which is de novo lipogenesis, was decreased. But there is, in fact, one study published in JCEM, where they demonstrated that the PNPLA3 variant is associated with decreased de novo lipogenesis. So even though this finding is surprising and somewhat puzzling, this fits with the previous data on the PNPLA3 mutation, and I think what we contribute on top of the previous data is that we might have a potential mechanism which may explain at least part of the. Yes.
But the dissociation is quite interesting. I'm not meaning that it's not. It's very interesting, and as you said, it might open new new mechanism to look at. So thank you, Panu, for your answer. We have two questions. A question from Birgit Andersen. So she's asking, so in genetic NASH, the increase in liver fat, well, it's the same. Is it due to decrease in beta oxidation or decrease in VLDL? Of course, that could be one of the
Yes, that's a very good question. In this presentation, I didn't address VLDL, but that is one additional mechanism by which these genetic variants can predispose to NAFLD, and I think that is one of the most best understood mechanism by which they confer the risk for NAFLD is by impairing the secretion of VLDL into circulation.
Yeah, that could be, because from what I understand in NAFLD patient, it's always complicated to know whether VLDL is actually decreased or increased. There's really depending on the study, and so beta oxidation could be a good lead, of course. There's also a question by Ricardo Amorim, and it's in fact in the same line. So Ricardo, sorry, I'm not gonna ask your question because it's the same concept. So there's a lot of interest in this discrepancy and original finding. There's also a question by Elsa Mustelli. She's asking, treatment with SGLT2 inhibitors induces an increase in beta-OH in beta-hydroxybutyrate. What can we expect if we treat those patients with those inhibitors? Do you know anything about that, Panu?
Yes, I do know something, and the first question that comes into mind is that if ketogenesis or if we stimulate or these SGLT2 inhibitors can stimulate ketogenesis, and in our ketogenic diet study we showed that increased ketogenesis is associated with inhibition of TCA cycle activity. So the question that comes into mind is that whether those agents can inhibit mitochondrial function, but I believe that their action is more complex than that, and it would be interesting to study how
it works.
Yeah.
Panu, can you stop sharing, because I think there was a question from the panel. Sorry.
Yes.
Oh yeah, many, but we are a little bit late already, but we'll take, I think, Christopher, you were the first one to ask, to raise your hand, so go ahead.
Thank you, Catherine. Well done, Panu. That was a very nice piece of work. I too wanted to ask about the VLDL, but we've addressed that. So you've used HOMA-IR as a proxy for hepatic insulin resistance. It's not you didn't do stepped clamps, which might have been better. So first of all, would you like to comment on how good you think it is in this situation in assessing hepatic insulin sensitivity? And then the second question really relates to, how do you know that mitochondrial function is the same in your genetic versus your metabolic NAFL? Because if there were differences in mitochondrial function, mitochondrial damage, there's more severe liver disease usually with genetic rather than metabolic NAFL, you might expect there to be more mitochondrial damage, and that itself might give you a difference in the redox state.
Okay, let me first answer the first one. So I believe that HOMA-IR index works really well as an index of hepatic insulin resistance in individuals who do not have insulin dependent diabetes. And the reviewers asked us about these questions, and we repeated all analysis after excluding the diabetic individuals. There were no changes in the results. So I don't believe that these results would change too much if we would have done stepped clamps. But for the mitochondrial function, in this study we didn't directly measure hepatic mitochondrial function, but it would be of high interest to do so.
Thank you.
Thanks. So we'll take the question from Dr. Chupin. You're muted.
I will be very quick. I think these are very good and interesting data, especially data that would have predicted the failure of ACC1 or even 2 inhibitors, which were definitely failing in clinical studies, Gilead, etc., in license via Nimbus, I think. And would you explain? So it's a safe stop, safe de novo lipogenesis is some kind of safe stop, could be, and therefore ACC1 inhibitors wouldn't really work. They can perhaps delipidate the liver, but nothing else. What is your opinion?
Yeah, I believe that my hypothesis is that there's a wide range of, like, there's no single pathogenesis in NAFLD. There are individuals who have more of the genetic component, and other individuals may have less of the genetic background, but more of the obesity and dysmetabolic background. And I would speculate that these individuals respond to different treatments in a different way.
Yep.
Thanks. We'll take the question from Kit.
Well, it was more if you could share with us why you think that the underlying defect in the genetic version is the redox state. What would the mechanism for that be? That's
an excellent question. I wish I would have the answer, but my first clue is that since we saw in our ketogenic diet study that if we increase the availability of hepatic fatty acids, those fatty acids can then undergo beta oxidation and thereby increase mitochondrial redox state. So that's my number one clue. But of course, things usually are more complex than we think. So we will find out.
Thank you, Panu. Last question from Hannele. We're already late, but it's better to have questions than a long break.
Just a question. Panu can answer to me all my questions, but the comment regarding de novo lipogenesis and lipolysis. When we do these measurements in humans, we do not assess intrahepatic pathways like lipogenesis or lipolysis inside the liver. We are just measuring lipolysis and de novo lipogenesis. And there is no a priori reason to think that de novo lipogenesis should be increased because the substrates are not increased and insulin is not increased. And none of these genetic variants actually influence, de novo lipogenesis in any way. So I don't think we even have a hypothesis that the de novo lipogenesis should be increased. Plus, again, my favorite topic is about mice, that in mice, I think it's much more active than in humans, that, the many studies showing that actually it's not the major pathway and not the major explanation to fatty liver in humans. So that was just a quick comment regarding your question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Panu.